My first love in video games is not games like Red Dead Redemption, it's fighting games. And I have been a huge fan of fighting games for almost as long as I've been playing video games. Not completely, because the genre didn't exist until probably 1991 when Street Fighter II established the conventions of it. Street Fighter II was a huge global smash hit, and it was the first game that really kind of had everything that you expect from a fighting game. And every fighting game since then has adapted conventions from Street Fighter II, even if, some of the more out there ones maybe kind of rebelled against them on purpose. It was still a reaction to something that Street Fighter II had already done. But most of them just adapted what Street Fighter II had done. Some of them so closely that Capcom literally tried to sue them for copyright infringement. And there was a whole host of copycat games, most of which didn't amount to a lot necessarily. Street Fighter was the franchise that kind of went on to be successful, and then, other games that kind of did things differently, like Mortal Kombat or Virtua Fighter or Tekken. And I was a fan of all of these, and you could probably tell, for example, I've got an older Tekken theme as my background music. But Street Fighter was the one that I really loved, and I loved it even when it was just a prototype back at Street Fighter 1 in 1987, and it had most of the elements that would later be associated with fighting games. The only one that it lacked was a roster of colorful and very different and diverse selectable characters. When you played Street Fighter 1, you just had to be the game's protagonist, who was Ryu. And you could maybe be Ken if you were on second player and challenged somebody to a two-player game and won and then went on, although there was no different story for them or anything like that. And a lot of people think that story and fighting games don't really matter. All you need to do is, you pick your guy, you beat up everybody who comes at you, and that's that. I couldn't disagree more. I think that the story elements, as sparse as they were part of the secret to Street Fighter II's success. Not everybody was into the really competitive play. In fact, I think most people probably weren't, quite honestly. And, obviously the people who are really into the competitive play are really into it, but most people aren't, including me. And I'm a huge fan of the franchise, and I'm a huge fan of that type of game, but I don't have any interest in playing it competitively. I play it rather casually, and it's kind of something where I just kick back and relax at kind of a medium difficulty against the CPU, and that's how I like to play. And one of the things that kept people plunking quarter after quarter and continuing the game was trying to get to the end so you could see what the story ending was for each of the characters. And personally, I didn't see most of them. At least I didn't see them because I had won them until I got my own copy on home consoles. And my first one I had was Street Fighter II, the original Street Fighter II for Super Nintendo, which was pretty close to an arcade perfect translation. It was a pretty good one. I later also got Super Street Fighter II, also for the Super Nintendo. And so for a little while, that's what I had. So I think the story is important, and I think that having characters that had some character and some color to them and some interest is part of what drew you into the game, and you kind of connected a little bit to the character because you understood something about their motivations and what they were doing and what was going on with them, and they had a story to them. And the story, as it kind of evolved through the course of the franchise, in many ways is comparable to the story of a Marvel superhero. And I think that's a very good comparison, because let's face it, these characters are straight up superheroes, and they have straight up superpowers, and they wander around kind of completely above the law, the way that superheroes do in comic books, and kind of just do their own thing like superheroes. And now they don't have costumes and secret identities and stuff like that, but they do pit themselves against supervillains who in some cases have supervillain organizations. And I'll even make the case that Shadow Lu is directly comparable and in fact almost identical in every sense to something like Hydra in the Marvel series of movies and comic books and other associated properties. So the story did kind of develop. In Street Fighter 2 it was a little sparse, but stuff kind of got added to it, and as we bumped from Street Fighter 2 to Super Street Fighter 2, they made some additions. As they continued to make other games in the franchise, they added a lot more to the story. They retconned even things that had been in the story before, and they got changed. And there kind of ends up being this entire story of the entire franchise, but it's a little difficult to piece together. The only element of any of the games that plays out like a story that's easy to follow is the general story mode associated with Street Fighter V, the most recent game that was released. And it's not exactly new, it came out a few years ago. I think there's a lot of new people to Street Fighter V right now though, because just a few months ago they released the Champion Edition, which reviewers and fans in general kind of said this is the game Street Fighter V should have been all along. It seems to have been well received and a lot of people have bought it, enough so that while Capcom had initially kind of decided they were done with Street Fighter, they decided to add one more season of DLC content just based on the sales and the reception of Champion Edition. So I think there's a lot of people who are kind of new to Street Fighter V specifically. Like me, I actually rented it when it was new and was really disappointed at the incredible lack of content and said, I'm not super interested in this game, whatever, maybe I'll come back when they've finished it, which is what I've now more recently done, and I got it in its Champion Edition form, and maybe I bit just a little bit too soon because now it seems like there's going to be another season of DLC and there'll probably be another final edition of the game, and I'll have to buy it as upgrade kits, and it'll probably be a little bit more expensive that way, but you know, whatever. In the meantime, I get to have it and I get to play it. Let me try to lay out the Street Fighter story as best I can, and I'm not going to talk about the details. It's difficult enough to even piece it together in the right order, much less, you know, figure out exactly what happened. And there's a lot of every character kind of has their own little story. Most of them, quite honestly, don't contribute too much to the general story of the game. Only kind of the main protagonists and some of the other ensemble cast of pseudo-protagonists, and then maybe sometimes the story of the villains too. Those are the only ones that really kind of advance the main story. And then in the meantime, you've got side stories that are related to, you know, individual characters, and some of those are frankly, they've gotten kind of silly and they have no bearing on anything. You look at some character like Blanca, for example. His whole story is about how he was cheated by some company that wanted to convince him that people were really into little Blanca doll merchandising, but nobody was buying them, so he was sitting in a warehouse full of stuff. And it's kind of like, what? What does this have to do with anything? But, you know, he's kind of like a side story that kind of devolved into a joke. The main story is at least played straight, if not entirely always serious, at least it's straight. And like I said, it's not great literature. It's not super well written. You play the story mode in Street Fighter V, and you will probably think, wow, some of these characters are really kind of stupid. You will probably think, wow, some of this dialogue is super cringy. You will probably think, wow, these plot holes and Deus Ex Machina events are kind of just embarrassingly bad craftsmanship from a storytelling perspective. And I'm not going to tell you that those things are untrue. I will tell you, though, that I think that there's a lot of gold buried under that dross. And if you look at, for example, something like the Star Wars prequels, which are not very well made movies. They have terrible dialogue. They're infamous for it. They're not very well acted. The pacing is really bad. But the stories themselves, there's really nothing wrong with them. And in fact, there's some really iconic elements and iconic characters. And all they needed was a much more competent screenwriter to sit down with those outlines and that material and say, this needs another level of polish and a little bit better level of craftsmanship, and I can turn this story into something that really pops. Because the story itself is fine, the characters themselves are fine, there's just craftsmanship issues in the execution of it. And I think that that's similar. Honestly, I think that's similar with a lot of the comic book stories that were adapted and turned into cinematic movies. And maybe they're not necessarily masterpieces, but they're certainly successful and they're well received. And almost everybody loves the Marvel movies. Even the ones that are not as good as the others are okay, with the exception of Captain Marvel. That's the only one that nobody really likes. Maybe Iron Man 3, I don't know, or Iron Man 2. And I think that that's kind of what's going on with Street Fighter 2. I think that there's a decent story there. It's just wasn't really super well executed. And I almost wish that somebody could take a hold of that. Somebody with some real attention to detail and craftsmanship, turn it into a great screenplay, or maybe more than one screenplay, because it is a complex, complicated story, and make some superhero style movies out of it, quite honestly. That's what I think that Street Fighter's potential is. So I'm a fan of the story, even while I recognize its faults and flaws. But like I said, it's tricky to figure out. The games don't go in order, they bounce around chronologically. Trying to figure out exactly what happened is often difficult. You have to play the game with every character. You have to figure out which ones are kind of just weird little side stories and which ones are important, which ones are kind of what ifs, which ones are, quote unquote real. And then there's other things that you have to figure out that aren't even in the game. There's things that people from Capcom have said here and there and are in, guides and books that have come out, published by Capcom. And I'm not talking about licensed things like the comics by Udon or the anime by whoever made it, or certainly not the live action movie with Jean-Claude Van Damme, certainly not that one. I'm just talking about stuff that Capcom themselves put out as kind of official tie-in stuff, like here's the guide to Street Fighter. So I'm going to go through the storyline, and I'm not going to hit all the details. It's going to be super high level. I'm basically going to be focused on trying to put the games in order and say, this is basically what happened at a super high level, and this is how long it takes. And my premise is that so this first Street Fighter game came out in 1987, and it was supposed to take place about now, the time that it came out, so in 1987. Ryu's birthday was given at about 1964 or something. He was supposed to be 23. But I think there's a sliding scale. The games don't advance at the same pace as real life, and in fact, because they bounce around. So Ryu's supposed to be 20. Forget the years. Ryu's supposed to be 23 in Street Fighter 1. I'm going to make the case that from the beginning of this chronology to the end of it is roughly 10 years. And I'll try to fit all of the games that matter into this in those 10 years. Before I do so, I need to point out that there are some other franchises by Capcom that tie into Street Fighter, and that should be obvious. For example, that Final Fight ties into Street Fighter, because a ton of Final Fight characters, in fact, most of the main Final Fight characters, have made some kind of appearance in Street Fighter, usually as playable characters, although there's a few that have only ever been cameos in some characters' ending or in the backgrounds of the stages. They're sitting there watching the fights and stuff like that. And unfortunately, the main character of Final Fight, Mike Hagar, is one that has never made it to Street Fighter, and I don't understand quite why that is, especially because they added him to Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. So we had a character model ready to go. He really should have been part of the final update to Ultra Street Fighter 4, but he wasn't. He's never been in any Street Fighter game. I don't know why. It's a little disappointing. But anyway, Final Fight and Street Fighter clearly take place in the same setting. A lot of characters are in both, although that's kind of a one-way thing. A lot of Final Fight characters have made their way into Street Fighter, but I don't know of any Street Fighter characters that ever made their way into a Final Fight game. If Final Fight is part of the Street Fighter canon, that means that the Saturday Night Slam Masters series of games, and it was I think 2 or maybe 3 games, which is kind of a prequel to Final Fight, has to also. However, I'm going to discount those because I don't think they're important. The only thing that they add is kind of some backstory and prequel to Mike Haggar's story, and since Mike Haggar doesn't even appear in any Street Fighter game except as a spectator in the background, that doesn't really matter. And other than him, there's no other character that ever really makes an appearance in a Street Fighter game. Rival Schools is another franchise that probably ties into Street Fighter. Sakura, who is a Street Fighter character from the Alpha series and beyond, also was a character in Rival Schools, which makes sense because she was supposed to be a high school age teenager at the time. However, that's another one that it only goes one way. She was in a Rival Schools game. The only other thing that's ever happened to tie them together is there is one Street Fighter V stage that has some Rival School characters in the background watching the fight. And that might just be an Easter egg. It doesn't necessarily an indication that they're really in the same, setting and they're really belong together. But either way, because neither Saturday Night Slam Masters nor Rival Schools added anything significant to any character that is in Street Fighter, I'm not going to count them. So I'm going to talk about Final Fight and Street Fighter games only. Final Fight was initially designed, it came out in 1989, it was initially intended to be seen as a sequel to the first Street Fighter. However, and it was even pitched as such at industry shows, and a lot of the industry people kind of said, why are you considering this a sequel to Street Fighter when it's a totally different kind of game? So they ended up scrapping that idea and just making it its own series, but they did keep the ties to them. Let's kind of try and go through the chronology as best we can, and I'm going to go through them in the order that they were released, and then at the end I'm going to piece them back together. The first game to come out is Street Fighter 1987. You could play as Ryu. This, like I said, it had all of the elements of Street Fighter 2, although it wasn't done as well, obviously, but it had all the elements except for one thing. You could only select the protagonist character, who was Ryu. You couldn't select anybody else. But everything else was there. The special moves were there. The progression from, one country to another, where you fought a whole bunch of different people and got to some bosses and fought them. The boss here was Sagat, who was supposed to be this invincible champion, and he was holding a tournament so that he could beat up everybody who thought that they could challenge him. And Ryu won, and because he was the protagonist, right? And at the end of it, there's the award ceremony, but he doesn't care because he's Ryu and he's just looking for the next challenge, right? So he skips the award ceremony and goes walking off into the distance like some, 80s TV show character walking off into the sunset with sad music playing or whatever. It's not much of a story, but that's kind of it. Sagat doesn't have a scar at this point. He gets that in this tournament. I should point out that that's kind of how it was presented at the time. It was later retconned that Ryu didn't really win. In fact, Sagat was beating him, and it was basically over. And Sagat, who Capcom decided that they were going to not have him be a villain anymore after all. After a while, they decided to retcon that too. So they tried to make him more honorable. So Sagat was going to go help Ryu up because he was beaten. And then Ryu was taken over by the dark side of the Force and performed a Sith Lord version of his Dragon Punch instead of the Jedi version that he normally does, which is what scarred Sagat, and Ryu then became the winner because of a cheap thing, actually. And but this, I'm not sure that I necessarily agree that was a good or a bad change, but the whole point of it was that they were setting up this struggle that Ryu was having with the Dark Hado. And Hado is some weird esoteric Street Fighter term. I tend to just call it the dark side of the Force because that's basically what it is. So Ryu is kind of set up with this struggle, and all through the entire franchise, he's kind of trying to deal with it. Finally in Street Fighter V, he's separated himself from the dark side of the Force and has become a Jedi like his father. Or in this case, a Jedi like his master, Goken, who was his teacher, him and Ken's teacher. So that was Street Fighter, came out in 1987, and I've even talked about how they kind of retcon the story a little bit. Final Fight comes out in 1989. As Mike Hagar is now mayor of a thoroughly corrupt and criminal-infested metro city, which is kind of a fake New York. It's clear that, and this is, I don't know why, The Warriors was not a movie that most people remember, but a whole lot of people who have done other creative endeavors are fans of that movie, and I really think Metro City and the gangs kind of owe a debt of visual design, if nothing else, to The Warriors. So Mike Hagar is, dealing with these gangs, and he's trying to be a straight mayor, and the gangs are trying to pressure him into letting them do what they want. So they kidnap his daughter. So Mike calls his daughter's boyfriend, Cody, and Cody's best friend, Guy, and they just go kicking butt from neighborhood to neighborhood across the city looking for Jessica and beating up gangsters. At the end of each section of town, there's a boss. This is where you get characters like Sodom is one of the bosses, Rolento is one of the bosses, Abigail is one of the bosses. Most of these, Eddie E is one of the bosses. He's one of the few who never made it into Street Fighter. And then at the very end, they fight Belger himself, who is the head of the Mad Gear gang. It's not entirely clear if he's handicapped or not, but he sits in a wheelchair that's some kind of weird mechanized thing with weapons, and it's, he's actually more dangerous because he's in it. And he gets knocked out of his penthouse and falls to what you would think would be his death, but he continues to make cameos in background scenes all the way up to Street Fighter V at least. So I'm not sure if he's actually dead or not. Curiously, there was a Final Fight game, Final Fight Revenge, which was kind of more of a fighting game than a side-scrolling beat-em-up. I don't think it's really canon, although maybe it's kind of half canon. It has Belger as literally as a zombie, which would imply that he is dead, but somehow he came back as a zombie, still trying to run his gang. I don't know. I think that's probably not really supposed to be taken very seriously. So anyway, Final Fight is the next game. Street Fighter II then comes out in 1991 and is a global smash. It introduces a lot of new elements. Sagat is still in it, but he is now lieutenant to M. Bison, who seems to be running this organization called Shadowloo. We don't know much about it yet. We first kind of get the impression that it's basically just a mafia type organization or something like that, but it later becomes clear as we get more and more into it that it's not really the mafia. It's really more like Hydra, and Bison is not a crime lord. He is a supervillain intent on conquering the world and dominating it through, with his iron fist and his superpowers and his super weapons and his super science. But we don't know a lot of that yet. We just kind of know that he's a bad guy and Shadowloo is his organization. Chun-Li's father disappeared investigating him. Guile's best friend Charlie disappeared investigating them. So a lot of characters get added. A lot of them have ties to Shadowloo, or I don't know if you want to say ties. Like I said, Guile and Chun-Li have a score to settle with Shadowloo. They later add, in the Super Street Fighter update, they add 4 new challengers. Most of them have something to do with Shadowloo as well. T-Hawk has a girl of his, he's an Indian, and a girl of his tribe in Mexico or in the Southwest or wherever it is he's supposed to be from exactly, has been kidnapped by Shadowloo. Cammy has amnesia, and she's with some kind of weird super soldier special forces group, and in her ending, Bison claims that she used to be in love with him, and before she had amnesia. This is later retconned and rewritten into something totally different as well. But that's kind of how it started. Curiously, Ryu, who seems to be the protagonist of this game, does not seem to be the victor of this tournament. And it is set up as a tournament again, where Bison holds this as a tournament, and all these guys fight each other to try to not be eliminated so they can go fight all the bosses and eventually fight Bison. Ryu does not seem to be the victor. It seems like Guile is who Capcom intended to be the victor, I think. Although they've been a little bit cagey about that, because I think they want everybody to kind of have their own experience or whatever. And of course, every character has an ending that kind of plays out as if he's the one who won, because you see it after you've won, right? So which one of those is actually the canonical version, and which ones are not necessarily canon but probably still happened, but just the character didn't win, is a little bit hard to kind of tell. But it seems like Capcom intends that Guile won. And they also made a change at the last minute. In the very last version of the game, and there were 5 different versions of Street Fighter II before they left it. And then they later came back and made a couple of even, other additional ones for different systems, or, the high-def remix, and they made some more changes then. But they made a change in the very last one, which was Super Street Fighter II Turbo, where they introduced a secret character, Akuma, and if you played well enough, he would actually swoop in at the last moment and kill Bison with his super secret Karate Sith Lord move, and then you would fight him as the boss instead of Bison, which was a little shocking, I guess, and it was curious because it was actually based on a little bit of an in-joke and an April Fool's joke that a games magazine had done. And they thought, hey, we should actually do that for real. And so they came up with Akuma as this secret character, and you could even be him. He became a mainstay of Street Fighter for a while. But this was his first appearance, was at the very end of Street Fighter II. After that, in 1994, Street Fighter bumped up to the Alpha series. It had totally different kind of graphics that were based on the graphics that Capcom had already used for their X-Men Children of the Atom game and for their Darkstalkers game. They kind of have more of a line art animation type of look to them, like an anime or a Disney movie or some other kind of animated movie. And so this is kind of the style of the Alpha games. Alpha does not take place after Street Fighter II. It actually is set in between Street Fighter 1 and Street Fighter 2, and Alpha, had a little bit younger versions of some of the characters. It had some new characters, but it also added some Final Fight characters. It added some Street Fighter 1 characters. Alpha was a little bit sparse when it first came out, but then they later updated it into Street Fighter Alpha 2. Street Fighter Alpha 2 overwrites 1, though. It's not meant to be a sequel. It's kind of the same story told again, except now with a little bit more details and more characters. And in this one, so I'm going to call it Alpha 2, even though it's Alpha and Alpha 2. I'm going to call it Alpha 2 just for simplicity, because that was the most recent version of it. This one, there isn't a tournament. It's just a bunch of fighters running around pursuing their own agendas. Ryu comes back home after Street Fighter 1 to find out that his master Gouken had been killed by Akuma, who was his brother, and so he's all looking for him. Ken is looking for Ryu to challenge himself, because Ken has won the U.S. martial arts tournament, but feels like he is still going to fall behind Ryu if he doesn't, because they were best friends and they training partners, and they kind of had this trying to one-up each other all the time, kind of rivalry even so, and so they're always kind of trying to keep up with each other and outdo each other. Charlie is now a playable character, the one that Guile says was killed by Shadow Lu, but here he's a playable character. Chun-Li's already looking for her lost father, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of side stories too, but basically the two thrusts of this Our Shadow Lu is up to something. They are now revealed to be more like a Hydra organization with all kinds of crazy super science. They have secret bases in Brazil with, military hardware. They have the psycho drive that makes, Bison powerful. So there's the guys investigating Shadow Lu, and then there's the whole story about Akuma and how he's become this fallen, like I said, like a karate Sith Lord. He's like, karate Darth Maul or something. And he's kind of, Ryu wants to beat him, but, Akuma fights him and says, you need to embrace the dark side of the Force too, so you can be my equal, and then we can have like a real fight. And so that all happens. And then Capcom releases Street Fighter 3, the new generation, which, as it implies, takes place considerably later than Street Fighter 2 and is a whole new generation of fighters. In fact, it was their initial intention that they weren't going to have any characters from previous games, and somebody who was smarter than the developer says, you better frickin' put Ryu and Ken in there, or the audience is going to revolt and say, I don't even think this is really a Street Fighter game. So they did put them in, but they had a totally different supervillain who's Gil, and a totally different super villainous organization, which is the Illuminati. Gil is this, weird red and blue fallen angel / Greco-Roman / elemental / Messiah cult figure. I don't know. It's kind of weird. They're either going to cause, or they know that it's going to happen, some apocalypse. The Earth's going to basically be destroyed. Their hand-picked survivors are going to go somewhere where they can avoid the destruction or cause it. I'm not quite sure which. And then build their utopia from the ashes. Street Fighter 3 then got another update. They had Street Fighter 3 Second Impact or Double Impact. I can't remember what it was called. And it, like Alpha, kind of overwrote the first story. It didn't add anything new, except there's new characters, and so they have their own little side stories added in too. Even though Ryu and Ken are in it, the protagonist is supposed to be Alex, who's kind of this reluctant fighter, but his best friend or trainer or mentor or whatever was put into the hospital by Gil, and so now he's kind of looking for revenge. The story here is a little weird, and it's a little harder to follow. Capcom then finally finished the Alpha series. They made a Street Fighter Alpha 3, which for a long time I would have said was the best game in the series. It has tons of characters. It's got a really great story. This time now Bison is everybody's villain, and the focus is kind of on, Akuma's still in it, but the focus is on Bison and his Shadow Lu super weapon and stuff, and his psycho drive is in full swing, and Bison is super powerful. He kidnaps Ryu and tries to, extract his dark side of the Force or something. Bison's all running around trying to clone bodies so he can be immortal and move from body to body. Turns out he's got this program called Dolls with these brainwashed and programmed teenage girl assassins. Cammy is kind of the lead of these and the best of them. She's called Killer Bee. She breaks free at the end of this, but that's where her amnesia shows up. This takes place before Street Fighter 2, obviously. At the end of it, Charlie is killed. Bison is actually killed, and his psycho drive is destroyed, which is kind of odd because he obviously shows up again in Street Fighter 2, and he's still talking about psycho power. But, that's kind of the point. So he's got this whole deal where he's trying to clone replacement bodies and trying to find immortality of a sort by bouncing from body to body if he's killed, or somehow being reanimated or reincarnated or whatever exactly it is. So he does come back in Street Fighter 2, but because of the events of Street Fighter Alpha 3, he's weaker than he was in that game, and he still needs to kind of, I don't know, he's kind of not where he was at the end of Street Fighter Alpha 3. He was full-blown supervillain in Street Fighter Alpha 3. In Street Fighter 2, he's, kind of more of a gang lord. Although they kind of, like I said, they kind of retconned the story by and made it more important that he was more of a supervillain, I guess. But I think they also kind of intended to make it so that he had been weakened by his first death. And of course he was killed again at the end of Street Fighter 2. And of course he shows up again, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. The next game in the series is the final version of Street Fighter 3 called Third Strike. This one, like Alpha, it's not a rewrite, it's a next chapter of the story. Sorry, one thing I forgot to mention is that Capcom did say, offline so to speak, that there was 2 years between Street Fighter Alpha 2 and Street Fighter Alpha 3, and that they both take place between Street Fighter 1 and Street Fighter 2. And then Final Fight 2 and 3 and Revenge, if anything in there is Capcom or is canon related, would have also probably taken place between Alpha 2 and Alpha 3. So we sandwich an awful lot of material in there. Like I said, Final Fight 2 and 3 and Revenge contributed relatively little to Street Fighter, though. It's really kind of the first one that is the real source of most of the stuff that makes its way to Street Fighter. And to be honest with you, even in Street Fighter, the Final Fight characters kind of seem to be in their own parallel path. They're not really super involved in the story of Shadow Lu and whatnot. But anyway, Street Fighter 3 Third Strike came out. It is actually a continuation. Alex kind of finally comes into his own, and Gil lets him win or something, and I don't know. It seems, although it's a little difficult to tell, because again, you got to figure out which endings really count and what matters and what really happened. It seems as if the Illuminati kind of go off into the sunset, presumably to wait for the impending apocalypse that they believe is going to happen, so they can come back again and make their utopia in what's left after the apocalypse. I kind of tend to think of them as the supervillain version of Heaven's Gate, though, and whether or not this apocalypse is really going to happen is rather debatable, because they're supervillains. So although I think it is kind of a feature of Japanese culture as opposed to American, that they're a little bit more fatalistic, whatever. Street Fighter 4 then comes out in 2008. There's a huge gap where Capcom goes fallow and doesn't even make stuff really for a while. But then they come out with Street Fighter 4. Street Fighter 4 takes place after Street Fighter 2, probably about a year, because there's a few things have to happen. Ken, for example, is married in his ending in Street Fighter 2. In Street Fighter 4, Eliza's pregnant, and she actually has the baby during the game, and in the ending he has, Mel is born. So I'm thinking that there's about a year, give or take a few months, between Street Fighter 2 and Street Fighter 4. In this case, Shadow Lu is gone, but there's another organization that kind of came out of the ashes of it that acts basically exactly like it. Seth is the leader of it. He seems to have been an artificial person of some sort built by Shadow Lu, who was meant to be a replacement body for Bison. Again, with the replacement bodies and the clones, he seems to have all kinds of replacements, but he never seemed to like any of them. I'm not quite sure what was happening. Somehow Bison is back, though. Even though he's been killed twice, he comes back again. He's in Street Fighter 4, and the basic story is that Bison basically defeats Seth, takes over his organization, which is called Sin, S-I-N, not the most subtle of names since they're supervillains, and he basically turns it into Shadow Lu again. And then we move on to Street Fighter V, which is the most recent one, and Street Fighter V takes place after Street Fighter 4, but before Street Fighter 3. There seems to be a bit of a gap, though. If you play the story mode, you do see Ken's son Mel, and he looks like he's about 4 years old. So he's born at the end of Street Fighter 4. He's probably about 4 years old in Street Fighter 5. So that implies that there's a good 4 years or so that happens there without anything going on. There's no games to fill that gap. In this case, Bison has become full-blown supervillain. He's threatening the whole world with his Black Moons and Operation Chains project. He's got a new general to replace Sagat, who Capcom decided they didn't want him to be a villain, so they brought in this other guy who everybody loves to hate because he's super villainous in like obvious ways. And you know, they kind of do this whole Street Fighter V story mode, and all these people, this time everybody's out to stop Bison because he's literally threatening the whole world. Even the Illuminati are trying to stop Bison, although they're doing it a little bit discreetly, like they bring Charlie back to life as kind of a Frankenstein creation, and they kind of dole out little hints of what's happening to some other people so that they can kind of go fight Shadow Lu in their behalf as patsies. And then the other good guys kind of want to fight him too because, you know, he's threatening the world. Like I said, I don't know that this story is great, but it works. It's reasonably good. They all sneak in. They all go repeatedly to Shadow Lu's secret base, which can't be very secret since everybody seems to know where it is. And they go fight people and do stuff, and they thwart Bison's plan. Charlie sacrifices himself again using, you know, some spark of power given to him by Gil to somehow negate the psycho power. Meanwhile, the psycho power generator, the psycho drive, is kind of deactivated. So Bison is now sufficiently weakened that Ryu, who has always been the franchise protagonist, and they finally actually make him really the protagonist in this case, Ryu is finally able to defeat Bison, and this time it's for real, and he's really dead for real, and Shadow Lu is really destroyed for real, and Nash is really dead for real. And so then we're set up, and in fact there's kind of like a Marvel-style end credits, a scene in the credits where, you know, some of the characters are now talking to Gil, and we're kind of phasing into the Illuminati getting ready to take over. And it's assumed that there's not too long between Street Fighter V and Street Fighter III, which is chronologically the last, because Mel, Ken's son, doesn't look like he's much bigger, so I don't think that it could even be much more than a year. Some characters had to have a few changes, so a few things had to have happened. It couldn't have been literally weeks, but it could have been, you know, as little as a few months to a year to get those changes set up. So now that I've kind of talked through everything, let me super quickly try to lay everything out. So Ryu is 23 in Street Fighter 1. Final fight takes place in the same year as Street Fighter 1. He goes back home to his master Goken's place in Japan and finds out that he's been murdered after Street Fighter 1. This prompts the events of Street Fighter Alpha and Alpha 2, which take place at most a year after Street Fighter 1. So let's advance Ryu's age to 24. Then we are told that there's a 2-year gap between Street Fighter Alpha 2 and Alpha 3, where, you know, Bison kind of has his big rise and his first fall. So that means we need to advance Ryu from 24 to 26, right? Because 2 more years happen. And then there's not too long a time between Street Fighter Alpha 3 and Street Fighter 2. Enough time that Bison's able to come back and some other characters are able to kind of, you know, get involved. So let's say another year between Street Fighter Alpha 3 and Street Fighter 2, which makes Ryu now 27. Street Fighter 4 takes place probably about a year after Street Fighter 2. That makes Ryu now 28. Now there's another 4 years until we get to Street Fighter 5. Ryu would now be 32. Maybe another year before we get to Street Fighter 3 and Second Impact. That makes Ryu now 33. And then, I don't know how long, probably another year at most till we get to Third Strike. That makes Ryu now 34. So Ryu is gone from 23 to 34. Some of those are a little hand-wavy. So let's just say that the gap it's roughly a 10-year span between Street Fighter 1, which is the first game in the series, and Street Fighter 3 Third Strike, which is chronologically the last. And we're kind of all over the place there, but like I said, there's an interesting story here with supervillains that are comparable to, you know, what we see in these Marvel movies, and superheroes that are comparable to what we see in the Marvel movies. And although it was executed rather poorly, I really think that there's a lot of potential here. I think the story is a diamond in the rough that could be handled by the right writer and turned into something really cool. And honestly, I'd love to see that happen, just because I've been a huge fan of Street Fighter from the very beginning, from 1987, and I've never really not been a fan of it. And I have a big collection of lots of different Street Fighter games on various systems. And now that I'm not playing Red Dead Redemption all that much, I'm actually playing Street Fighter 4 mostly, which is my favorite of the games, and some Street Fighter 5 because it's the most recent one that I picked up. And I'll probably also pull out my old PlayStation 2 and play some Street Fighter Alpha 3 and Capcom vs. SNK 2, because I think those are the only two that really hold a candle to it still, in terms of, wow, I'd like to go play that again. So I love this stuff. I think there's potential to it. Hopefully this video has been a little bit helpful to you if you're relatively new, if you've come on to Street Fighter 5 because of the Championship Edition and you're like, what is the deal with this story? It doesn't make any sense, and there's obviously a lot of backstory that I don't get. This is what it is, and this is how it all kind of evolved and how Capcom kind of developed it in a weird spiderwebby fashion, bouncing all over the place, retconning stuff as new ideas occurred to them, and really kind of doing stuff in a weird way. But the end result is, like I said, some good material that just needs a little bit of polish to really snap.